It is the greatest mismatch in military history, a catastrophe no one saw coming, an unbelievable gamble where the odds were not just stacked against the defenders, they were functionally infinite. We are talking about the moment the world held its breath, praying that 300 men could somehow hold back the force of an entire enraged empire bent on global domination. Xerxes wasn't just a king. He was a living god to his subjects, a man who saw mountains as mere inconveniences and oceans as obstacles to be chained and whipped into submission. Legend says, when a storm destroyed his pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, he ordered the sea itself to be flogged 300 times, demanding obedience from the very elements. And now, his gaze, heavy with infinite entitlement and divine mandate, was fixed squarely on a tiny fragmented peninsula called Greece. He wasn't just planning an invasion, he was planning a total systemic erasure of freedom. And he brought an estimated 1,000,000 souls, 1,000,000 shields to reflect the blistering sun, and 1,000,000 blades eager to taste Hellenic blood. The logistical nightmare of this invasion was staggering, a feat of organization unparalleled in the ancient world. They didn't just bring soldiers, they brought engineers to carve roads, cooks to feed a small nation, and slaves to carry the wealth of an empire. Their supply chain stretched back thousands of miles, a vulnerable but unstoppable serpent winding its way toward total annihilation. The Greeks, meanwhile, were a joke to him, a collection of squabbling city-states, arguing over who had the best rhetoric, completely unprepared to face the hammer blow of organized, centralized despotism. Athens, the center of fledgling democracy, was terrified, desperately building its navy. Sparta, the only power capable of facing this nightmare on land, was distracted by the sacred religious festival of the Carneia, forbidden by their ancient laws to march their main army until the holy days were complete. The clock was ticking. The relentless Persian advance was already shattering resistance in the north, and desperation breeds the kind of courage that borders on suicidal madness. They needed a wall. They needed a miracle. They needed a place where the 1,000,000 could be reduced to a handful, where numbers ceased to matter, and only sheer, unstoppable, murderous will remained. That place was Thermopylae, the infamous Hot Gates, a geological bottleneck created by the sheer, unforgiving mountains sloping down to the churning waters of the Malian Gulf. This was a narrow, treacherous pass, where the sheer cliffs of Mount Kallidromo met the sea, leaving only a tiny strip of sand and stone, the perfect, unavoidable choke point to bleed an empire dry. It was here, in this sweltering, forgotten corner of Greece, that a king named Leonidas, accompanied by 300 hand-picked Spartans and a few thousand reluctant, fearful allies, decided to draw a line in the sand. Leonidas was no fool. He knew the truth of his mission. He was not sent to win a battle. He was sent to buy time, to provide a glorious, defiant sacrifice that would shame the rest of Greece into action and prevent the naval invasion from bypassing the Greek fleet at Artemisium. This wasn't strategy. This was defiance carved into rock. This was the ultimate, theatrical, historical no, whispered directly into the face of a million-man tidal wave. Xerxes, when he heard the laughable count, 300 Spartans and a smattering of allies, did not feel fear. He felt insulted. He thought they were mad. He thought they were committing ritual suicide for sport. And in a way they were. But Xerxes failed to understand the Spartan mindset. They didn't fight to live. They fought to ensure their name echoed forever, choosing death with glory over life with dishonor. For 4 agonizing days, Xerxes simply waited, believing the small band of defenders would surely flee at the sight of his endless host. He was giving them a chance to survive, a testament to his own supreme confidence. But when they did not move, when the scouts returned reporting that the Spartans were casually combing their long hair and exercising, preparing not for retreat, but for the greatest fight of their lives, Xerxes' patience snapped. Rage replaced arrogance, and the order was given. This story is not just about the incredible fighting on the 3 days of battle. It's about the impossible logistical nightmare of moving a nation across continents, the political maneuvering that nearly doomed Greece before the first arrow flew, and the catastrophic, simple betrayal that turned a desperate holdout into the most glorious, doomed last stand ever recorded. Get ready, because what happened in these few agonizing days at the Hot Gates changed every subsequent page of human history. This is the chronicle of the Battle of Thermopylae, a saga of blood, fire, and the unbreakable spirit of 300 ghosts who still guard the road to freedom. The silence before the storm is over. The million are arriving, and Leonidas knows, deep down, that today they dine in Hades. Forget everything you thought you knew about warfare. This was not a clash of spears. This was a cosmic insult delivered by a god-king who demanded that the earth itself bend to his will. His supply lines stretched back to the limits of the known world, a logistical nightmare requiring fortified food depots and communication relays that dwarfed the size of some independent Greek cities. When Xerxes sat upon his gilded throne, carved into the side of a mountain, watching his army march for 7 consecutive days and nights, he didn't see soldiers. He saw an endless, obedient river of flesh and bronze, numbering well over 1 million fighting men, supported by twice that many servants and logistical personnel. His arrogance was the 10th wonder of the ancient world. When a storm destroyed the first pontoon bridge he built across the Hellespont, a crossing point critical to moving his millions, did Xerxes humbly rebuild? No. He ordered his engineers to publicly flog the sea itself, whipping the waves and branding the water with hot irons, declaring the water treasonous because it dared defy the great king. This was the terrifying megalomaniacal ego that Leonidas dared to face. This was the overwhelming power that 300 men were setting out to shatter, not just militarily, but psychologically. And the sight of their advance was enough to break the sanity of lesser men, a sound like 10,000 thunderstorms rolling across the mountains. The army was a horrific tapestry of the subjugated world. Terrifying Ethiopian archers draped in lion skins, chariots pulled by Scythian horses, and the silent, deadly infantry of the Assyrians. But the true terror, the beating heart of the Persian machine, was the Anusia, the companions, the legendary immortals. These were Xerxes' elite, 10,000 strong, a terrifying cohort who maintained their exact number at all times. If one fell in battle or to illness, another was immediately inserted, creating the psychological illusion of an army that could literally never die. A perfect, seamless killing machine, clad in dazzling armor and carrying distinctive gold pomegranate counterweights on the butt of their spears. They moved with a discipline unknown to the Greeks, a silent, disciplined wave that promised complete annihilation. They were not driven by love of home, but by the cold, absolute obedience to a king who was viewed as semi-divine. Their mission was simple: eliminate the defiance, pave the way for the rest of the empire, and report back to their king that the tiny, rebellious peninsula called Greece was now just another province in the sprawling Persian map, and they were coming for the soul of Sparta first. But Thermopylae was waiting, the hot gates, a geographical anomaly designed by the gods specifically to give the few a fighting chance against the many. It was a narrow coastal path, less than 50 feet wide in places, squeezed between the sheer cliffs of Mount Calidromo and the deep, cold waters of the Malian Gulf. It was a funnel of death, a place where sheer numbers ceased to matter, where the massive wings of the Persian army would be clipped and forced into a lethal, concentrated column. Leonidas understood geometry better than any general in history. He knew that the key to survival was maximizing their density and nullifying the enemy's breadth. The total Greek force assembled was a meager 7,000 souls, drawn from various fractured states, Thespians, Phocians, Thebans. But the core, the unbreakable shield, was the legendary 300 Spartiates, free men of Lacedaemon, standing shoulder to shoulder with their helot attendants, who were just as ready to bleed for freedom. These 300 were not just soldiers, they were the embodiment of an ideal. Each one was a veteran, a master of the deadly, beautiful dance of the hoplite phalanx, forged in the brutal agoge, an education system designed specifically to strip away fear and replace it with absolute loyalty and lethal efficiency. They had arrived at Thermopylae, not expecting victory, but expecting their names to be etched into the very bedrock of history. They knew they were a suicide squad. The massive Persian army had already been delayed slightly by a naval battle at Artemisium, where the Greek fleet held the line. But the land invasion was now inevitable, unstoppable. Leonidas stood on the cliff overlooking the gulf, the sunlight flashing off his Corinthian helmet, watching the endless tide of the enemy gather like a dark, cancerous stain on the horizon. He had received messengers, spies, and even some Greek turncoats, all urging him to flee, to save the core of the Spartan army for a later, more defensible fight closer to the Isthmus of Corinth. They spoke of the futility of facing 1,000,000 men with 7,000. They described the immortals' perfect discipline. They detailed the terrifying arrow volleys that could literally blacken the sky, turning the light of day into a false twilight, a promise of sudden, suffocating death. The message delivered to him by a nervous Persian herald was simple, blunt, and dripping with arrogant pity. Lay down your weapons and surrender to Xerxes, and you may live. Leonidas, king of Sparta, looked out over the gulf at the approaching doom, adjusted his crimson cloak, and delivered his answer, a phrase that would echo through 2,500 years of civilization, a perfect, defiant refusal that marked the beginning of Western freedom. He simply said, "Molon labe. Come and take them." The signal was given, the shields locked. The silence returned, thicker and colder than before. The Sleep Chronicle was now moving from the slow, agonizing dream of dread into the terrifying, sharp reality of the battle itself. Xerxes was done waiting. The immortals were now marching, their golden pomegranates shining brightly under the unforgiving Hellenic sun. Part 2 ends not with a whimper, but with the first terrible roar of war, echoing off the narrow walls of the hot gates, announcing the most glorious, suicidal stand the world has ever witnessed. The gates were closed. There was nowhere left to run. The battle for the soul of the world had officially begun. Xerxes, perched upon his golden throne, carved into the mountain overlooking the hot gates, did not just command an army. He commanded a deluge. He was the human tide, convinced that mere mortality could not withstand his divine will. Historians still reel, trying to calculate the true horror. But let us be clear. Xerxes brought the world with him, a living, breathing, earth-shaking manifestation of conquest, easily numbering in the millions when you account for the baggage train, the servants, the logistics, and the endless, terrifying mass of subject nations forced into service. He watched the pitiful Greek line, a mere 7,000 souls, led by 300 men who had signed their own death warrants, and laughed. It wasn't a tactical formation. It was a joke played upon the very concept of warfare. He believed the sight of his endless banners and the deafening roar of his advance would cause these Greeks to simply dissolve into the dust. For days he waited, not out of caution, but out of sheer, towering arrogance, giving Leonidas and his pathetic band time to realize the error of their ways, time to flee like rats before the flood. His scouts brought back reports that the Spartans were doing nothing but drilling, sharpening their spears, and, most bizarrely, oiling their hair, as if preparing for a holy festival or a wedding. This report infuriated the god king. They were defiant to the point of absurdity. They treated their impending annihilation as a minor inconvenience before dinner, a casual appointment with destiny that merely required clean equipment. This was not a military engagement. This was an insult to the divine right of the Achaemenid Empire. Leonidas didn't care about winning the battle. He cared only about winning the delay. Every hour they held the line was an hour Athens could evacuate, an hour the rest of Greece could mobilize its crucial fleets, an hour Xerxes' monumental logistics chain stretched thinner than dry parchment, threatening to snap under the weight of its own impossible supply demands. They prepared the pass meticulously. They reinforced the ancient Phocian wall, a crumbling barrier of stone and debris, using it not as a primary defense, but as a staging point, a killing floor, perfectly positioned between the unforgiving mountain slope and the treacherous, muddy sea edge. The air itself was thick with impending mortality, smelling of salt, sulphurous hot springs, and the freshly polished bronze of shields. The Spartans were chillingly calm, a tranquil pool of focused phalanx in the center of the storm. They were not fighting for life, they were fighting with life, spending it like the most valuable currency for the survival of everything they held sacred: their culture, their freedom, the very idea of self-governance. Finally, after 4 excruciating days of waiting, Xerxes' patience snapped. He was insulted by the silence and the audacity of the small bronze line. On the 5th day, the sun rose on a scene of utter madness. Xerxes did not send his elite. He sent the expendable, the human shields. He sent the Medes and the Cassians, fierce warriors in their own right, but subject nations, whose loss would not be felt deeply in the heart of the Achaemenid core. They were intended to be the broom that swept away the debris, the initial human wave that merely tired the arms of the Greeks before the real fight began. The sound was a horror show, the millions of footsteps transitioning from a low, distant hum to a pounding, earth-shattering drumbeat, the cacophony of thousands of men screaming war cries that echoed off the sheer cliffs, driving themselves forward into the narrowest part of the chasm. The first ranks of Persians charged into the choke point, confident that their overwhelming mass would dissolve the Greek line in moments, crushing them under the sheer weight of bodies. But they slammed into the phalanx like a wave hitting granite. The Spartans and their allies had formed a shield wall so tight, so disciplined, that it moved and breathed as a single, lethal organism. The long, heavy Doru spear, nearly 10 feet of sharpened death, held two-handed and thrusting forward with the weight of the entire formation, found gaps in the lighter Persian wicker shields and cloth armor with horrifying, bloody efficiency. The Medes were instantly bewildered. They were trained for open battle, for archery and rapid maneuver in wide fields. Here, they were pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to effectively draw their shorter blades, unable to retreat, forced into a grinding, suffocating meat grinder designed by Leonidas himself. For hours, wave after wave of Medes crashed and shattered against the relentless bronze wall. Xerxes, watching from his distant throne, could not believe his eyes. He saw his finest subject warriors being chopped down by men who appeared to be fighting casually, with a terrifying, almost bored efficiency. They were holding the world at bay with nothing more than discipline and pointed steel. The losses were catastrophic for the Persians, who were trapped between the spears in front and the angry, desperate soldiers behind them, pushing them forward into the lethal funnel. Leonidas occasionally employed a terrifying tactical feint. The Greeks would suddenly turn and run, pretending to break, luring the overconfident Persians into the wider, slightly less defended section of the pass. Then, with the speed of coiled vipers, the Spartans would halt, pivot, and slam back into the disordered Persian column, catching them in the open, turning their hasty advance into a chaotic, panicked slaughterhouse. Xerxes reportedly leaped from his throne 3 times in sheer sputtering rage as he watched whole detachments of his army evaporate into the dust of the hot gates, failing to break even the first layer of resistance. The first day was a total, humiliating disaster for the God King. His army, which could dam rivers and empty seas, had been repelled by fewer men than his own personal bodyguard. He had lost thousands to a handful of defiant Greeks, proving that the prophecy of the oracle, that only the death of a king could save Greece, was perhaps being fulfilled, not by Leonidas's physical death, but by the symbolic death of Xerxes' supreme divine confidence in his own invincibility. The battle for the soul of the world had officially begun. The battle had begun, but not with a clash of steel. It began with a sound so deep and pervasive it rattled the teeth of every man standing on the Phocian wall, a sound that spoke of the geological impossibility, of the sheer weight of humanity pressing into the narrow pass. Imagine the earth groaning, not under the burden of a mere army, but under the terrifying advance of a moving, weaponized continent, marching straight toward a handful of desperate men. For 4 agonizing, suspense-filled days, the Persian army, in its incomprehensible entirety, was held back. Not by the wall, but by the sheer, unbridled arrogance of Xerxes himself. He sat on his gilded throne, placed meticulously high above the action, commanding the best possible view of the coming spectacle, believing utterly that the mere sight of his host would shatter the pathetic nerves of the Hellenes huddled in the passage. He waited, confident that the presence of nearly 2 million souls, infantry from 30 subjugated nations, chariots from Egypt, terrifying cavalry from Media, and archers whose collective ammunition could literally blot out the sun, would be enough to force a broken, panicked retreat from the minuscule defense force of 7,000 Greeks. But Leonidas and his Spartan corps did not flinch. They did not retreat. They used those 4 critical days not for terrified prayer, but for sharpening the points of their bronze doru spears and exchanging grim, cynical jokes about the softness and impracticality of Persian silk uniforms. The waiting was the hardest part, the silent dread building like a tempest in the throat of every man. Finally, the King of Kings grew bored of the psychological warfare. The sight of the Greeks stubbornly refusing to bow was an affront to his divinity. On the 5th day, Xerxes flicked his royal wrist, a gesture of impatience, and unleashed the first wave. But he did not send his finest, his ultimate weapon. He sent the expendables. First came the Medes and the Scythians, soldiers renowned for their ferocity and speed, but utterly unprepared for the claustrophobic, psychological meat grinder that was the Greek defensive phalanx. These men were armed for wide-open fields, for sweeping maneuvers, not for the tight, lethal choke point of Thermopylae. They surged forward, tens of thousands of them, funneling into the narrowest point of the pass, where the Phocian wall met the surging tides of the Malian Gulf. The sheer, overwhelming density of their numbers immediately became their fatal flaw. They couldn't maneuver, they couldn't deploy their famous archery, and they certainly couldn't use their numbers to surround the enemy. They were instantly reduced to a screaming, panicked mass, slamming headlong into a solid, unmoving bronze shield wall, a human battering ram against an immovable fortress constructed of specialized muscle, rigorous training, and a profound, cold, unyielding hatred for any form of tyranny. Leonidas, the master butcher, understood that in this tiny corridor, sheer specialized training beat raw numbers, and devastating deception beat brute force. He introduced the legendary, terrifying Spartan maneuver, the feigned retreat, a trick designed purely to break the formation and shatter the morale of the enemy. The Spartans would suddenly turn, momentarily shattering the perfect cohesion of the phalanx, and sprint backward, drawing the ecstatic, blood-lusting Medes deeper into the pass. The Persians, scenting immediate victory and believing the legendary defense had finally cracked, would break their own ranks and surge forward after the fleeing Greeks. And that is the exact moment when the real terror began. With a sudden, synchronized pivot that seemed to defy the chaos of the battle, the Spartans would halt, wheel around with dizzying speed, and instantly reform the shield wall with their spears leveled for the killing blow. Xerxes, watching the impossible unfold from his ivory throne above the chaos, grew incandescent. He could not and would not comprehend what he was witnessing. His vast, unstoppable, world-conquering tide was being casually repelled, even humiliated, by a mere ripple of defiance commanded by a handful of stubborn farmers and 300 Spartans. On the second day of fighting, there would be no more games. Xerxes, boiling with frustrated rage, decided it was time to deploy his ultimate psychological weapon, the finest, most feared fighting force the world had ever known, the Immortals. 10,000 men, so named because their number was never allowed to drop. If one fell, another immediately replaced him, maintaining a terrifying, endless tide of flawless humanity. These elite soldiers, led by the distinguished Hydarnes, were the Emperor's Guard. They wore heavier armor, carried superior curved weapons, and their discipline was absolute, forged over centuries of conquest. They marched into the pass, expecting only to sweep the scattered corpses of the Medes aside and execute the remaining Greeks by midday. But the Spartans were ready. They knew this was the true test, the moment the myth met the ultimate military legend. They tightened their formation, bracing for the impact of a force that had been taught that defeat was not merely possible, but genetically impossible. The Immortals hit the Phocian wall with the terrifying, deafening force of a tsunami striking a granite cliff face. The clash of metal reverberated through the mountains, shaking dust from the stone. Yet the cliff did not crack. It held firm. The Spartans were fighting with the grim, desperate fury of men who knew they were already dead, but intended to take 1,000, perhaps 10,000 souls with them to Hades before their final rest. The great king, the shadow of Ahura Mazda on earth, felt the cold, sharp sting of doubt, a sensation utterly foreign to his gilded existence. This tiny band of Greeks, this infinitesimal mosquito bite in the vast ocean of his power, had dared to make him pause, had dared to slow the relentless march of the immortal empire. Xerxes' reaction was not fear, but a magnificent, terrifying contempt, a royal fury that made the very atmosphere around his tent shimmer with heat, a magnificent impatience that demanded immediate, brutal resolution. He commanded the messenger to ride out, not with terms of surrender, but with a statement of unavoidable fate. The ultimatum was simple, yet dripping with the casual cruelty of absolute power. Lay down your arms and live. The answer that thundered back from the narrow, sun-baked pass was a legendary moment of defiance, a single, perfect Greek phrase, echoing through history. Molon labe. Come and take them. This response was not just a rejection. It was an insult hurled directly into the face of a man who believed himself a god. Xerxes, in a breathtaking display of royal arrogance, refused to attack immediately. For 4 agonizing, sun-blasted days, he waited. He truly believed that the Spartans, seeing the limitless, terrifying horizon of his forces, would finally break, that reason, the Persian version of reason, would prevail, and they would simply scatter into dust. Imagine the sheer auditory horror of those 4 days, the constant, grinding noise of 1,000,000 men existing, the low rumble of supply wagons stretching back 50 miles, the multilingual cacophony of 46 distinct nations camped side by side. The Spartans, hunkered deep within the Phocian wall, did not just see men, they saw a logistical nightmare turned into a living, breathing tidal wave, ready to crash over them with overwhelming force. When Xerxes finally accepted the impossible truth that these Greeks were genuinely suicidal, the order was given. He chose his first hammer blow carefully. Not the elite, terrifying immortals, whom he saved for the inevitable, glorious final cleanup, but the Medes. These were warriors of immense bravery and skill, men who had long served the Achaemenid Empire. Yet they were being sent on a sacrificial mission, a test run against the rock of Spartan discipline. The engagement began with a roar that swallowed the valley whole, but as the Medes rushed into the choke point, they hit an unbreakable, living wall. The Spartan defense was not merely defensive, it was a deadly, synchronized engine of destruction, perfectly calibrated for this impossible geometry, a masterpiece of ancient military technology. The phalanx locked down, a single, impenetrable shield of bronze and muscle, layered 8 ranks deep. The Medes, accustomed to fighting in open fields where their numbers could envelop and crush, found their superior quantity turned instantly into a profound liability. They could not flank, they could not maneuver. They were simply funneled into a killing chute. They were forced to push, shoulder to shoulder, into the lethal, synchronized spear thrusts of the hoplites. The very narrowness of the pass meant that perhaps only 50 Persians could engage the Spartan line at any one time, guaranteeing that every blow struck by the Spartans was effective, while 99% of the Persian army stood idle, waiting their turn to die. Leonidas, standing at the very heart of the conflict, was not just a king. He was a machine operator, overseeing the perfect deployment of human resources. He commanded swift, brutal rotation maneuvers. When the front rank of Spartans began to fatigue, they would seamlessly retreat through the ranks, replaced instantly by fresh, roaring, killing machines. What he saw instead was a massacre, but the blood belonged only to his own men. The Medes were routed, falling back in complete disarray, their morale shattered by the sheer impossibility of breaching that tiny, defiant line. The King of Kings was reportedly seized by a fit of uncontrolled, incredulous rage. He leapt from his seat, tearing at his robes, unable to process the data. His first wave, shattered by a few hundred men. He immediately ordered the second, even more ferocious attack, throwing the Scythians into the fray, demanding a victory, demanding results, demanding that this humiliating anomaly cease immediately. The Scythians charged, their resolve bolstered by the sheer terror of disappointing the great king. But the Spartans had a trick, honed in the brutal training pits of the Agoge. Leonidas commanded the famous feigned retreat, a deceptive maneuver used to break the enemy's discipline. The Spartan line would suddenly appear to break, turning and running back down the pass, luring the overzealous Persians forward. Just as the Scythians surged confidently into the gap, believing victory was theirs, the Spartans executed a breathtaking, instantaneous pivot. He had saved his finest, his most terrifying weapon for the inevitable easy mop-up, the Immortals. 10,000 elite warriors, the personal guards of the king, whose very name was meant to instill instant paralysis in the enemy, were now called upon to avenge the failure of their lesser brethren. Xerxes released the Immortals, led by the trusted general Hydarnes, expecting them to sweep the exhausted Greeks aside like dust. But the Immortals, for all their magnificence and terror, were still human, and they were still constrained by the brutal geography of the hot gates. They marched confidently into the pass, only to meet the same impenetrable shield wall, the same endless, grinding death. The psychological damage inflicted upon the Persian Empire that evening was irreparable. Their perfect, terrifying units were rendered useless by simple stone and shieldcraft. For the Immortals to be repulsed, to be thrown back, to be forced to retreat in disorder before the sight of a few hundred weary Greeks, it was an omen, a cosmic insult that echoed across the entire Achaemenid world, shaking the very foundations of Xerxes' divine claim. The sun rose on the second day of the world's most impossible war, bathing the narrow choke point of Thermopylae in a horrifying crimson. The air itself was thick, not just with the salt spray of the Aegean, but with the metallic tang of 1,000 failed charges, and the silent, growing panic spreading through the Persian ranks. Xerxes, the king of kings, who had been promised a swift, brutal execution of the Greek resistance, was now staring out from his golden throne across a valley choked with his own dead. His arrogance was curdling into a venomous, unbearable frustration. How dare these insignificant, barely clothed mountain people defy the very will of Ahura Mazda, the divine mandate that allowed him to command the sun itself? This was not war. This was an insult to his divine right to rule, a public humiliation played out on the global stage. Let us dwell for a moment on the sheer, terrifying spectacle of Xerxes' headquarters during this second day. The tent was a cavern of silk and gold, but inside, the air crackled with a silent, murderous energy. Xerxes, famed for his calculated cruelty, had been reduced to pacing like a caged beast. He had witnessed his own royal guard, the Immortals, humiliated. These men, drawn from the Persian nobility, trained from birth in the esoteric arts of silent killing and relentless advance, were the embodiment of Achaemenid power. Their very presence on the battlefield was supposed to drain the will to fight from the enemy. They wore gold rings and carried pomegranates of gold at the butt end of their spears, symbols of their eternal, flourishing vitality. They were the terrifying psychological weapon that had never failed. Day 2 demanded their ultimate sacrifice. Xerxes played his ultimate card, sending the Immortals, 10,000 strong, to prove that the Greek resistance was merely an illusion waiting to be shattered by true power. And yet, even the immortals found the hot gates to be an insurmountable, horrifying wall. The Spartans, 8 layers deep, locked shields and braced against the furious tide. The geography of the pass, barely wide enough for 3 men abreast, rendered the immortals' numbers utterly meaningless. Their terrifying reputation evaporated in the cramped, blood-slicked confines. They could not flank, they could not maneuver, and their longer, lighter spears were no match for the dory of the Spartan hoplite, driven by the absolute, muscle-memory conviction of men who had been training for this specific death since the age of 7. Leonidas, meanwhile, was conducting a tactical masterclass, turning the geography into a meat grinder. The Spartans did not simply stand and absorb. They manipulated the battlefield with deadly precision, executing the deadly, feigned retreat. They would suddenly break formation, pretending to flee down the pass, luring the enraged Persians out of the choke point and into slightly wider ground. The Persians, scenting victory, would abandon their caution, surging forward in a disorganized wave, desperate to finish the fight and earn the king's favor. This was their fatal mistake. Just as the Persians lost all cohesion, the Spartans would execute an instantaneous pivot, locking shields, reforming their dory-bristling phalanx in the blink of an eye, and driving forward like a massive bronze battering ram. The disorganized Persian masses, caught completely off balance, found themselves instantly compressed and crushed. The Spartans' short, double-edged swords, the Xephos, were instruments of pure carnage in this close-quarters chaos, designed specifically for stabbing and hacking when the spears were broken or discarded. The immortals broke. They did not retreat. They were shattered, their formations dissolving into a panicked, struggling mass of bodies trying to escape the Spartan killing zone. Xerxes, watching from his command post, reportedly leaped from his throne 3 times in sheer, sputtering disbelief as his most prized possession was humiliated by 300 men and their loyal allies. The failure of the immortals was a spiritual crisis for Xerxes. It suggested that his divine connection was flawed, that perhaps the gods of the Greeks held sway in this small, defiant corner of the world. His fury was so profound that messengers feared to approach him, knowing that a single misplaced word could mean an immediate, agonizing execution. The psychological victory of Day 2 was arguably greater than the physical one. The Greeks had not just held the line, they had broken the unbreakable. They had proven to the myriad nations gathered under the Achaemenid banner, Ethiopians, Indians, Arabs, Babylonians, that their king was not invincible, that his divine mandate could be defied by human courage. If this defiance was allowed to stand, if the story of the 300 spread, his entire empire, built on the myth of his unchallenged authority, would begin to crumble from within. The Battle of Thermopylae had now transcended military strategy. It had become a contest between the ultimate power of centralized autocracy and the terrifying anarchic freedom of the Western mind. Xerxes knew with a sickening certainty that chilled his royal blood that this stalemate could not continue. Every hour Leonidas held the line, the Greek city-states were mobilizing, preparing their fleets, and spreading the contagious legend of Thermopylae. If the main Persian force remained stalled here, the entire campaign would collapse. He needed a solution, not an army. He needed a key to unlock the insurmountable door. And keys are often held by the lowest, most desperate individuals. As the carnage of the second day faded into a cold, moonless night, the air hung heavy with the smell of defeat and the whispered dread among the Persian commanders. While the Spartans slept, utterly secure in the geographical certainty of their defense, a shadow moved through the hills above the pass, a shadow carrying a secret that would turn a legendary defense into a legendary massacre. Xerxes, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury, offered a reward so monumental, a prize so tempting, that it could buy the soul of any man in Greece. And in the dark heart of the mountains, a shepherd, a local man named Ephialtes, heard the call of gold and answered the king's darkest prayer. Ephialtes, the goat-herder, was the antithesis of everything Leonidas represented. He was poverty-stricken, fearful, and utterly lacking in the concept of honor or Hellenic duty. He saw not a strategic defense of civilization, but merely an obstacle between himself and eternal wealth. He approached the great king's tent, smelling of goats and desperation, ready to exchange the very future of Western civilization for a handful of Persian coinage. He knew the secret path, the hidden goat track known as the Anopeia, that wound high above the hot gates, bypassing the Spartan death trap entirely. This was the moment the scale of the conflict shifted, moving from a physical battle of attrition to a moral battle of treachery. The 300 Spartans had prepared for a glorious frontal death, but they had not prepared for the slow, agonizing realization that they were about to be outflanked, surrounded, and eliminated, not by strength, but by human weakness. That night, as the final, desperate watch was set at the hot gates, the immortals began their silent, terrifying climb up the mountain, guided by the whispering greed of Ephialtes. The clock was ticking toward the ultimate, unavoidable tragedy, and Leonidas, though still unaware of the looming shadow, had already begun making the preparations for his final, eternal stand. The deadlock was broken, not by courage, but by betrayal, ensuring that the Battle of Thermopylae would forever be etched in history as the perfect, yet flawed, sacrifice. The betrayal was a sickness, a poison injected directly into the heart of the Greek defense. When the sun broke over the mountain peaks on that fateful fourth morning, it illuminated not hope, but the horrifying clarity of impending doom. The scouts, men whose faces were etched with the cold certainty of death, stumbled back, reporting that the immortals, the silent, spectral elite of Xerxes' guard, were already flowing like black oil down the Anopeia path, the goat track revealed by the traitor Ephialtes. The impenetrable fortress of Thermopylae now had an open back door, and the hammer was about to fall. The strategic masterpiece built by Leonidas had collapsed, not under the weight of millions, but under the miserable burden of human greed. Leonidas, the granite king, heard the news. He processed the absolute finality of his position with the terrifying calmness of a man who had already accepted his fate on the day he left Sparta. The end was no longer a possibility. It was an hour, perhaps less, away. He knew that if the Persians converged, every single man remaining would be annihilated, without leaving a message, without leaving a myth. This realization necessitated the final, agonizing act of command, a decision more difficult than any battle charge. He had to send the rest of Greece home. He summoned the commanders of the remaining contingents, the Phocians, the Thespians, the Thebans, and issued the order of retreat. He told them to flee, to carry the warning to the south, to save the soul of Greece for the inevitable land battle at the Isthmus of Corinth. They were the future, he thundered, and their lives were not to be wasted in this cold ditch. Many wept openly, their loyalty warring fiercely with the desire for life. But the Spartan king's word was absolute. They began their heartbreaking, hurried retreat, leaving the Spartans to face the closing jaws of the colossal trap alone, knowing they were abandoning their king to his eternal sleep. Yet 3 forces remained. The 300 Spartans, of course, bound by the sacred laws of Lycurgus and their oath to Leonidas. They were the immovable, lethal core. Then came the contingent from Thebes, men whose allegiance was deeply suspect, many historians believing Leonidas kept them forcibly as hostages to prevent them from immediately defecting to the Persian side. They were reluctant attendees at this funeral pyre. And finally, the 700 glorious men of Thespiae. Their general, Demophilus, declared that they would not abandon the Spartans. They understood that the battle was now about setting an example, not survival. They chose to transform military annihilation into spiritual triumph, electing martyrdom over retreat, choosing to stand with the king until the last drop of Persian blood, or their own, was spilled. Just over 1,400 souls remained, facing a 2-pronged assault from perhaps 20,000 elite warriors already mobilized for the final push, with millions more waiting eagerly behind them. Xerxes, fully informed of the flanking success, was jubilant. He ordered his main army, now led by the most savage of his commanders, to advance one last time, certain the remaining Greeks would break and surrender instantly. He was wrong. Leonidas had not spent the morning waiting for the shadows to lengthen. He realized that if he stayed in the narrow pass, the flanking immortals would simply turn the defense into a slaughterhouse. He made a decision so radically aggressive, so utterly contrary to standard defensive doctrine that it instantly cemented his legend. He ordered his men to advance out of the narrowest part of the pass and meet the Persian army on slightly more open ground. This was not a defense. It was a furious, premeditated suicide charge, a final, lethal spasm designed to inflict maximum psychological devastation on the enemy before the end came. The Spartans and Thespians burst out of the Phocian wall like a coiled spring released, slamming into the advancing Persian column with the force of a tidal wave made of bronze and hate. The Persians, expecting cowed, defeated men preparing to beg for mercy, were thrown into instant chaotic disarray by this roaring eruption of disciplined fury. The Greeks tore through the first ranks, the sheer momentum of their desperation driving them deep into the Persian lines, their spears plunging again and again into the soft masses of flesh. Leonidas was the epicenter of the storm, a magnificent, terrifying figure, his voice a roaring signal over the clashing bronze, leading the charge from the front, knowing every second bought was 1,000 lives saved in the south. For a terrifying few minutes, it seemed as if the impossible might happen, as if this final suicidal rage might pactually shatter the Persian resolve. But Xerxes' numbers were infinite. The sheer weight of humanity began to tell. The Persians pressing in, wave after relentless wave, driving the Greeks back inch by bloody inch toward the original defensive position. It was during this ferocious, swirling retreat, amid the crushing sound of shields and splintering wood, that the inevitable blow landed. Leonidas fell. A roar of protective savagery went up from the Greek lines. They understood the devastating, symbolic weight of his body. Xerxes must not be allowed to defile the corpse of the Spartan king. The battle immediately devolved into a desperate, shifting struggle over the king's remains, the Greeks fighting with maniacal purpose, pushing back against multiple Persian assaults to reclaim their fallen leader. They succeeded, dragging the body back toward the wall, fighting 4 vicious engagements over the corpse of Leonidas, turning the central pass into an apocalyptic graveyard of honor. Simultaneously, the sound of trumpets echoed from the ridge above. The immortals, led by Hydarnes, had completed their march. The final hammer was swinging down. The Greek force, battered, bleeding, and now surrounded by an enemy attacking from both the front and the rear, gathered on a small, final hillock near the wall, the ultimate redoubt.